I want to tell you a story. It's an old story, more than 20 centuries old, and it's been told in nearly every corner of the globe. It's a story that's influenced cultures and nations and the entire course of history. Some love the story, some hate it, some just ignore it. Personally, I love the story. It changed my life when I was younger, and I've since built my life around it. But whether you love it or you hate it, or whether you've never heard it before, I want to tell you this story in a way that I believe will be new and fresh and exciting. So if you're ready, here's the story. Some call it the greatest story ever told. I call it the day the world changed. The story's about someone that most people of his own time had never heard of. But in his own small neck of the woods, a conquered Roman province, he did achieve a few brief years of fame. We're talking about a man that people now know as Jesus of Nazareth. But in his own day, his own people probably knew him as Yeshua ben Yosef, or Yeshua Nazarene. Jesus did not come from any privilege, wealth, or status. He was a common tradesman, a builder, a craftsman. His mother was known to have conceived him under questionable circumstances. People still gossiped about it in his day. He grew up in obscurity. Very little is known about Jesus before the age of 30. And then, very suddenly, he burst onto the public scene, saying and doing things that were astonishing to many people and deeply threatening to others. Jesus had a 3-year ministry in which he traveled from as far north as Lebanon and as far south to the Judean desert. He healed the sick, he taught the crowds, and he talked personally with people of all classes and backgrounds. Well, so much for the backstory. Now let's focus on the final week of Jesus' life, a week that we call Passion Week. Jesus began the week staying with friends in the village of Bethany, located 2 to 3 miles east of Jerusalem on the far side of the Mount of Olives. On Sunday morning, we call it Palm Sunday, he entered Jerusalem riding on a donkey. Now that sounds rather humble, but it was in fact a prophetic symbol of the coming of the Jewish Messiah. And the crowds acclaimed him as such with great enthusiasm. Hosanna, they cried, save us. And whether or not they fully understood what they were doing, they were actually welcoming Jesus as their Messiah, their King, to the holy city. And Jesus was the Messiah. He was descended from the line of David, born in David's city, Bethlehem. He was raised in Nazareth, which was also prophetic. Nazareth comes from the Hebrew word netzer, which means branch or shoot or sprout, which fulfills the prophecies in Isaiah 11, Jeremiah 23, and Zechariah 6 that the Messiah would be a branch from the stump of David's tree. Jesus was known as the Nazarene, the branch. So the crowd cheered him with hosannas, and after his triumphal entry, Jesus returned to Bethany for the night. On Monday, Jesus left early for Jerusalem. Approaching the city, Jesus wept because of its hard-heartedness. He entered the temple compound and cleansed it of the money changers and price scalpers, as he had done 3 years before at the beginning of his ministry. And after teaching the crowds, he left the city to spend the night once again in Bethany. On Tuesday, Jesus left early. At the temple, he was confronted by the religious leaders who tried to entrap him this time with trick questions. Now, on the surface, the questions they asked were legitimate, but each was cleverly designed as a trap. They were carefully crafted to get him to say something that would allow them to arrest him for sedition or blasphemy. And Jesus' answers confounded them, and he evaded their traps. But then he pronounced woes upon his critics for their opposition to what God was so obviously doing. On his way out of the temple, the disciples were remarking about the beauty of the buildings, and Jesus had to stop and tell them that in the not-so-distant future, not one stone of this magnificent complex would be left upon another. Leaving the city, Jesus took his disciples to the Mount of Olives, where he gave the Olivet discourse about the destruction of Jerusalem and the distant end times. After returning to Bethany for the evening, Judas, slipped away to bargain with the Jewish leadership council, the Sanhedrin, about the possibility of betraying Jesus. Now, Wednesday seems to have been a quiet day. Jesus remained in Bethany throughout the day, perhaps preparing for coming events. On Thursday, Jesus sent Peter and John ahead to make preparation for the Passover meal in Jerusalem. Now, there's some confusion about whether the meal they shared on Thursday evening was the Passover or just a meal in preparation for the Passover. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, seem to be saying explicitly that the Passover was not on Thursday, but on Friday that year. The Gospel of John, on the other hand, seems to be saying that Jesus and the disciples ate the Passover at the Last Supper on Thursday in the upper room. So which is right? Is there a contradiction here? Well, here's a possible resolution to the problem. History indicates that Jews living in Galilee and other areas away from Jerusalem may have sometimes celebrated Passover a day earlier than the official date of 14 Nisan, which was Friday of that year. An analogy for Christians today would be the fact that Western and Eastern Christians celebrate different dates both for Christmas and for Easter. So if that's true, then as Galileans, Passover was the Last Supper on Thursday for the disciples. At the same time, the official Passover was held beginning on Friday afternoon with the sacrificing of the lambs at the temple, which is exactly when Jesus died. So after sunset, Jesus washed the disciples' feet, they ate their meal together, and Judas again slipped away to meet with Jesus' enemies. During the meal, Jesus instituted new meanings into the elements of the Passover that we now observe as Holy Communion or Lord's Supper. And after Jesus' final teaching, often called the Upper Room Discourse, they walked to the Garden of Gethsemane. And there, facing the depths of his coming agony, Jesus prayed to the Father. Later, Judas arrived with a party of guards to arrest Jesus, and he was taken to the house of the high priest for trial before the Sanhedrin. And while Jesus underwent preliminary questioning, Peter snuck into the house to spy out the situation. But when confronted as one of Jesus' followers, he denied even knowing him. So in the early morning hours of Friday, the high priest and others questioned Jesus to find something they could use to charge him. And then once the entire Sanhedrin was assembled, Jesus was falsely accused of wanting to destroy the temple. He was condemned, beaten, and sent under guard to receive the death sentence from the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Well, Pilate was in a tight spot. Personally, he had no interest in Jesus or the issues behind why many of the Jewish leaders hated him so much. On the other hand, the charge against Jesus was so cleverly designed that it accused him of acts of insurrection against Rome and the inciting of mob violence. Pilate's decision was to avoid the whole situation by having Jesus beaten and then sent to Herod Antipas, the local Jewish official. But Herod treated Jesus as a joke and demanded to see some kind of miracle. And since Jesus flatly refused to perform one, Herod sent him right back to Pilate. So now Pilate couldn't wiggle out of the situation. He had Jesus severely scourged, in fact, nearly scourged to death, hoping that would satisfy Jesus' enemies. But no, they wanted the death penalty, shouting, "Crucify him, or we'll report you to Caesar. We'll tell him that you refused to deal with insurrection." Left with no choice, Pilate condemned Jesus to death by crucifixion. And his words were said to be, "Behold the man, ecce homo," in Latin. The soldiers and the crowd, some of whom had cheered Jesus just days before, ridiculed him and placed a crown of thorns on his head in mockery that he could be the king of the Jews. Meanwhile, Jesus was forced to carry the large horizontal beam of his cross out of the city to Golgotha, the place of crucifixion. Along the way, he was abused by the crowds and stumbled due to extreme loss of blood. A bystander, Simon of Cyrene, was drafted by the soldiers to carry the cross the remainder of the way, and Jesus finally arrived at Golgotha, or Calvary as it's said in Latin, just before 9 a.m. There the soldiers stripped him. They nailed his wrists and ankles to the assembled cross. They gambled for his possessions, and they waited for the crucifixion process to run its slow and very painful course. And even in this most pitiful and vulnerable situation, Jesus' enemies continued to insult and mock him. The hours wore on with Jesus' few loyal family and friends watching helplessly from the foot of the cross. Well, at first the day was a normal spring day, but then at noon, a strange and eerie darkness spread over the land that lasted until Jesus' death at 3 p.m. So over the 6 hours that Jesus spent on the cross, he seems to have cried out only once at the very end. And during those inexpressibly horrible hours, he said very little. In fact, only 7 comments. So about the soldiers, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." To the repentant thief crucified beside him, he said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." To his mother and his friend John, he said, "Woman, behold thy son. Son, behold thy mother." Then toward the end, he cried out, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani?" My God, why have you forsaken me?" He said to the soldiers, "I'm thirsty." And then he said to the world and the cosmos, "It is finished." And finally to the Father, he appealed, "Into thy hands I commit my spirit." At 3 p.m., Jesus gave up his spirit and died. At that point, the centurion, the Roman officer in charge of the execution detail, exclaimed the truth. Certainly this man was the Son of God. He was amazed when he saw the huge, thick curtain at the entrance to the temple some distance away, torn from top to bottom. The rocks were shattered by a huge earthquake, and many other cosmic events happened in testimony to the fact that cosmic events were taking place. Not long after this, 2 members of the Jewish Sanhedrin, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, who had believed in Jesus, they went to Pilate. They asked for and received permission to remove Jesus' body for burial. Then these men, along with Jesus' mother and other followers, took his body down from the cross. They gently wrapped it and carried it to a nearby unused tomb belonging to Joseph of Arimathea. They quickly prepared the body for burial and sealed the tomb before sundown, as required by Jewish custom. At the request of the Jewish leadership, the Romans posted a guard at the tomb to prevent rumors from circulating that Jesus was somehow still alive. Friday evening and all day Saturday, the Roman guard watched the tomb, and the disciples hid in terror and despair. But the world changed on Sunday. After the Sabbath was over, before dawn, some of the faithful women set out for the grave to finish the task of preparing Jesus' body. When they arrived, they were shocked to find that the tomb was open, the large stone that sealed the entrance cast aside like a piece of broken pottery, and the Roman guard bewildered and dispersed. Inside, they saw an angel who announced the amazing news that Jesus was risen and alive. Still stunned and amazed, the women started back to the city to tell the disciples. But perhaps overcome with amazement, Mary Magdalene lingered behind. She saw a man nearby that she took to be the gardener, but when Jesus called her name, she recognized him immediately. She desperately wanted to stay, but Jesus sent her to tell the disciples the good news. Following the other women, Mary rushed back to the city, and they breathlessly together told the disciples what they had seen. Thinking that the women were hysterical, Peter and John ran to the tomb to see for themselves, only to find it just as the women had said. So they returned to Jerusalem, they spread the word to the other followers, and they wondered what to do next. And later that day, Jesus appeared miraculously to the astonished disciples, of course, minus Thomas, who was not there at the time. Also later that day, Jesus appeared to some disciples who were fleeing Jerusalem to the city of Emmaus, a few miles to the west. They thought that this man was just another traveler at first, but then they recognized him as the risen Jesus when he broke the bread for their meal. Jesus appeared to others over the course of several weeks, including Thomas. He met with the disciples again when they traveled north to Galilee some days later. And it was at this time, by the Sea of Galilee, that Jesus commissioned Peter and others to feed and care for those who would follow him. Then some weeks after this, back in Jerusalem, Jesus ascended into heaven. At that event, angels appeared to the disciples promising that Jesus would return when his followers had spread the good news to the very ends of the earth. And so the story continues. He is risen. Yes, he is risen indeed.